All right, welcome back to PacWest Bigfoot. This is David, and I got a new headset, new microphone, and everything else. Hopefully, this works out pretty well. I usually like to use the podcast mics, but I've been having a problem with the podcast mics. I'm just using my headset today, so there you go. Real quick, before we get into this week's PacWest Bigfoot encounter story, I wanted to give a shout out once again to JP Choquette with her book. It's a fiction novel, a Bigfoot-based fiction novel. Called Shadow in the Woods. Some of you have already been commenting on it since I shared it with you last week and the week before, and you guys were like, oh my gosh, I couldn't put that down. I'm told you so. So, I'm going to tell you this. You can get it on your Kindle. You can kind of download it there. But I suggest getting an actual paperback. And that's the paperback there. And I'm telling you, get the paperback. You'll love it in your collection of Bigfoot books. As a matter of fact, another one that you ought to get is by William Jevning. Notes from the Field, Tracking North America's Sasquatch. I know William personally. As a matter of fact, I think I'm going to be meeting him here again in the next couple weeks here in Southern Oregon. And I also wanted to tell you that he has this awesome channel going on YouTube where he is doing a lot of encounter interviews. And I'm a fan of William Jevning, and he's a very good friend. And I have to tell you, I love his books. I own them all. I suggest you grab them. If you love Sasquatch and the whole subject matter and want to learn more, period, I suggest you get every single one of them. With that, let me clear the throat and grab a little bit of this Sasquatch coffee. Get the fire stoked. And let's get on with this week's PacWest Bigfoot encounter story. This one, the night visitor of Bonanza Camp. Bigfoot of the Salmon Challis National Forest. I was scared, afraid, and felt like I had a heart attack the day I saw Bigfoot enter my campsite at Bonanza Camp in the heart of the Salmon Challis National Forest one late spring. I was part of a group that would actually help to manage the area and clear debris and such from the trails nearby. I had planned to stay 5 nights in the camping area, even though it was still rather cold out, and even some snow was still on the ground here and there. But I would last only 3 nights before the sounds and experiences would turn into a full-blown visual of something that today keeps me out of the woods, a Bigfoot. Well, not completely out of the woods, but far away from there at least. The Night Visitor, Night 1. We were a small group back then of volunteers who would clear trails and keep the campground clean and free of the things that sometimes people do, like graffiti and such. This particular event happened when I was scheduled to put in a day or two of work on site. But instead of the day or two, I opted to take my week's paid vacation from work and spend 4 nights out there camping and enjoying the area, and that included hiking and visiting the Custer and Bonanza Camp ghost towns. But that very first night, I thought the ghosts had moved out of the towns and into the woods around me. Now I want to say this. I'm not sure if these Bigfoot things or animals are benign or not. All I know is that I felt, well, harassed, or bothered at least. Like I said, I was taking a week off the old 9-to-5 job to get out and enjoy the Bonanza Camp area, the ghost towns, and just the area itself before the main tourist season started. It was still a bit chilly out, and here and there the snow was still on the ground, as I said, but it was warm enough at night by that point, and would be, as the weather report stated, to tent camp. But I did not. I opted for my SUV. Early spring in Idaho can be cold, and although it was not cold enough to dump snow, I still felt better and more comfortable in the SUV. Listen, it's not like I was young when this happened, and when you're older, even somewhat chilly nights seem like you're in the North Pole. Trust me. Anyways, I decided the back of the SUV in and near the campfire. The first day was gathering some wood and chopping it, basically getting camp set up. I chose the furthest campsite back I could find from the main one. This was the group site, so only one main site with a few others was around. However, we took care of the other down the road a bit as well. Nobody else was staying here that I could see or tell. It was just me and the occasional deer or elk passing through. Bonanza Campground sits on the other side of a popular river and is pretty thick with pine trees. Not many, maybe not as much as further east into the Sawtooth National Forest, but the camp sits right on the edge where it starts to get thick and even more mountainous. Looking at a map, you can see that the campground sits in the national forest, but the terrain there is lightly wooded for about 500 to 600 yards, where it becomes thick woodlands like anywhere else in the Pacific Northwest. What I'm saying is that there is plenty of places this Bigfoot, could have come from, but I think it was passing through and came down off the mountains for better hunting or whatever. Glowing eyes in the night. The first night should have been had me convinced enough that something was not only lurking around and interested in me, but it should have given me enough reason to leave and come back some other weekend and not alone. I was done for the day, clearing out some brush and fallen limbs and small toothpick-like trees that had fallen across the campsites during the winter. It was towards dusk, and I wanted to eat and read for a bit. That night was venison steak I'd brought and some vegetables my wife packed for me. I cooked it up, ate, and turned on the radio to listen to the local public broadcast station, which to my surprise came in quite clearly. The campfire roared, and I even had a chance to have a couple iconic roasted marshmallows before brushing my teeth. I was standing near the edge of the camp while I brushed when I noticed a glint of red light flickering from about 20 or so yards away from where I stood. It was a pair of eyes, and I could tell it was eyeshine for sure. I heard before that so-called meat-eaters have red color of eyeshine. Remembering that at that particular moment made me a little nervous, but I put that in the back of my mind quickly. I turned and walked over to the SUV and grabbed my flashlight. I turned around again and put the beam in the direction of the glints of eyeshine. It was gone. Whatever it was gone. Maybe an owl or some bird of prey I thought was possibly sitting on a low-hanging limb, and that was what I'd made up in my mind it was. Anything else seemed a little far-fetched. I was back to my broadcast on the radio and my book by the fire. 3 a.m. and my mind would start reeling again with what I'd seen earlier that evening. I swear I heard an owl hooting, and it was so close to the campsite it was actually loud enough to wake me up out of a pretty sound sleep. For an owl, which soon enough I would know was not an owl, that was pretty loud. Every few seconds or so, you'd hear it, a hoo 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 like sound. I stood up real quick, looking out past the dim light that was available through the glow of the campfire embers. The night was somewhat clear, and the moon was out, and again the eyeshine, or flicker, could be seen once more. This time the sound turned into something like a monkey, a whoop whoop, then owls that hoot. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on. Once again, nothing. Disappeared. I waited for a minute or so before I turned it off, this time shutting the back hatch of the SUV and returning to sleep. Broken limbs and no sounds. The next day was just as weird as the night before. Over breakfast, I was feeling a little anxious, I have to admit, about the sounds and eyeshine the night before. However, natural and known phenomena could be the answer to whatever it was, even the weird whooping-like sound. Red eyeshine, that was easy. Bird of prey, that high up in the tree. The sounds, well, that is just the things wild animals do, I told myself. So I ate breakfast, washed up, and decided to take a short hike that day about 3 miles southeast of the group camping area after work. I was headed out when I decided to take a look in the general area of the eyeshine and whoop sounds the last time I had heard and seen them the night before. I looked around and noticed about 7-8 feet off the ground there were some limbs snapped off. Not completely, but hanging there, snapped nonetheless. That must have been an awful large bird, I thought. The limbs were freshly broken, I could tell as well. I did not notice them the day before while cleaning up. That set my mind to wonder a bit as I moved on and took my hike, which was uneventful as far as odd things happening, and it was beautiful and picturesque as far as hikes go. I even circled around and hit the little old ghost town, which was almost all but dust and old boards today. I returned to the campsite late that afternoon. I figured day 3 I would get some work done around the group camp, but I did do some of that that late afternoon, almost until dark. That is when things became really creepy. I was cleaning up the main camping sites when I got that feeling of being watched. I know some of you know that feeling. Well, I had it, and it was weird to say the least. I stopped to look around, and like I said before, there are a lot of trees here. It is not as thick as other places in the Pacific Northwest, but still, visibility was minimal to a point. I noticed no movement, and I noticed no sound. That is what creeped me out. The birds were no longer chirping away as they usually did. Something, even though I could not see it, was around. I could feel it. I set my tools down and decided I would take a moment and get something to drink and walk around the area a bit in hopes to shoo off whatever it was that was there. I had read many times that most predators of the Pacific Northwest dislike people and will flee most of the time when they are near. I'm not sure if it worked like that, but after a few minutes or so, the singing birds came back, and I returned to my work. The feeling of being watched also left me. Night 2, with me and you. Stew, some veggies, some more marshmallows, and a call for the evening. I started the fire a bit earlier in the afternoon as it was a bit nippier. I remember that second day well, the afternoon, that is. Some clouds had come in and left, but they hung out long enough to drop a sprinkle or two, and I swear I saw snow mixed in. It got that cold all of a sudden that afternoon. It did not get any worse, however. It was pretty cold that night, though. I was back to my reading and listening to the radio, but that night I kept the volume down, as to listen to any weirdness around me. I was right to do so. I heard footsteps about an hour after dinner. Must have been around 10 p.m., I recall. I was reading, listening, and just to the south of me, and moving northeasterly, I could hear someone walking. I knew I was alone out there, and hearing footsteps was a little, well, off-putting. Yes, hikers came through here and there. Even during the cold winters, here you get the extreme types, too. But this was heavy sounding, like a thud, 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 thud. It was unnerving, to be sure. I turned off my radio and listened closely. Thud, thud, thud. It kept moving through and past me to the north, just out of the light of the fire, as if it, or they, did not even care about it or me. The steps faded off eventually and did not return. Believing nothing or nobody mischievous was afoot, I turned the radio back up a bit, but still listened carefully to any and all sounds of the forest around me. I turned in around midnight after getting lost in my book when things had settled down back to normal. 2 a.m., and I was up practically yelling, or at least making myself aware of whatever or whoever was outside my SUV. I felt a bump or a push on the car twice. It rocked a bit, and I finally came to fully out of deep sleep and started yelling at whoever was pushing my car. I was not going to get out just yet, but trust me, I was not scared at that point. I would get out in just a moment. I heard the walking again, and this time in the faint light of the night I could see a shadow of what seemed to be a person. I literally got angry thinking it was a person trying to mess with me, so I unloaded with the yelling at that point and threats as I jumped out of the back of my vehicle. However, whoever it was, they ran off with their heavy footsteps back in the direction they came from earlier that night. I was livid, not scared. I would not realize fear until later that morning. I awoke as the sun came up and decided to look around the campsite a bit with a paper plate full of eggs and pancakes my wife sent along with me. I noticed what seemed to be impressions on the damp ground, but impressions only. They seemed rather wide and long for a person, which got my attention at first, but I dismissed it. I know what you're thinking. I am rather ignorant to what was happening. But until you really see one and know that Bigfoot exists, you have no idea to even expect such a thing out here. I did not yet at least. The Bigfoot I'll never forget. It was early still, just after sunrise. Well, the sun was peeking over the hills beyond a bit at that time. I finished breakfast while keeping my eyes scanning the area for any would-be hikers or whomever that was that night around the camp. I was still very mad. Well, upset at least. Nobody likes being jerked around, especially out camping in the middle of nowhere. That is why none of it still made much sense to me. Why would anyone do that? As I said, I was keeping a vigilant eye out as I moved about the camp after breakfast, continuing my work, and I'm glad I did. It seemed like it was something I'd seen the whole time, but it wasn't. In fact, it was not a large, beat-up, old, broken tree at all. It was a human-like figure standing there amongst the trees looking in my direction. I thought it was a large stump. I could not make out a face. Too much shadow was cast in the trees to do so. Either way, this thing was huge, at least 7 to 7.5 feet, half foot tall, at least. It stood there staring at me. It seemed to be hunched a bit, and its hands and arms were long, so long, in fact, they looked to go just past the knees of this thing. I could tell it was covered in hair and had no clothes on, so this was not some tall person wandering around the camp. It was, and I swear I said this aloud at the moment, but it was a Bigfoot. I stood still. It was mostly cloudy that morning, which did not allow for a good visual of the face, like I said, but I could see this thing move as it took in and released its breath. And it was swaying back and forth in a very weird-like manner. It was almost hypnotic, I guess you could say. There was no neck, that I was sure of. And the chest must have been 3 feet wide, as it was massive, I tell you. It kept swaying, and that is when I stepped back real quick. It did not move too much, or I did not move too much, but I did step back when it started swinging from left to right a bit more rapidly. It was frightening and downright scary to know at that moment I was looking at a so-called myth. A monster of the woods had come to life. This whole thing happened for about 20 seconds or so, maybe 30. It stopped swaying suddenly and like a flash. It seemed to glide off into the trees heading into the direction of the hills beyond. I caught my breath and did not move for another minute or so just in case. After that, I ran back to the car, packed up everything, and peeled out of there. I got to town in record time, and the moment I got home I could not speak for about an hour, but my wife waited patiently for me to calm down and tell my story. Loving Bigfoot, sort of. I'm not a researcher of Bigfoot today. Personally, once you see this thing for yourself, well, you're not sure if you want another encounter. That's a fact. I don't. But I am an enthusiast and enjoy listening to the shows like this one online and reading books here and there, fiction and nonfiction alike, about the subject. But like I said, I do not want to have another encounter like that ever again. Today, I am retired and still do some outdoor volunteering. But just so you know, I stay much closer to home today, just in case. Thanks, Richard.